Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was the eldest of Augustine and Mary's 6 children, all of whom survived into adulthood. The family lived on Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. They were moderately prosperous members of Virginia's middling class. Washington could trace his family's presence in North America to his great-grandfather, John Washington, who migrated from England to Virginia. The family held some distinction in England and was granted land by Henry VIII. But much of the family's wealth in England was lost under the Puritan government of Oliver Cromwell. In 1657, Washington's grandfather, Lawrence Washington, migrated to Virginia. Little information is available about the family in North America until Washington's father, Augustine, was born in 1694. Augustine Washington was an ambitious man who acquired land and enslaved people, built mills, and grew tobacco. For a time, he had an interest in opening iron mines. He married his first wife, Jane Butler, and they had 3 children. Jane died in 1729 and Augustine married Mary Ball in 1731. In 1735, Augustine moved the family up the Potomac River to another Washington family home, Little Hunting Creek Plantation, later renamed Mount Vernon. They moved again in 1738 to Ferry Farm on the Rappahannock River, opposite Fredericksburg, Virginia, where Washington spent much of his youth. Little is known about Washington's childhood, which fostered many of the fables later biographers manufactured to fill in the gap. Among these are the stories that Washington threw a silver dollar across the Potomac, and after chopping down his father's prized cherry tree, he openly confessed to the crime. It is known that from age 7 to 15, Washington was homeschooled and studied with the local church sexton and later a schoolmaster in practical math, geography, Latin and the English classics. But much of the knowledge he would use the rest of his life was through his acquaintance with woodsmen and the plantation foremen. By his early teens, he had mastered growing tobacco, stock raising and surveying. Washington's father died when he was 11 and he became the ward of his half-brother, Lawrence, who gave him a good upbringing. Lawrence had inherited the family's Little Hunting Creek plantation and married Anne Fairfax, the daughter of Colonel William Fairfax, patriarch of the well-to-do Fairfax family. Under her tutelage, Washington was schooled in the finer aspects of colonial culture. In 1748, when he was 16, Washington traveled with a surveying party plotting land in Virginia's Western Territory. The following year, aided by Lord Fairfax, Washington received an appointment as the official surveyor of Culpeper County. For 2 years he was very busy surveying the land in Culpeper, Frederick and Augusta counties. The experience made him resourceful and toughened his body and mind. It also piqued his interest in Western landholdings, an interest that endured throughout his life with speculative land purchases and a belief that the future of the nation lay in colonizing the West. In July 1752, Washington's brother, Lawrence, died of tuberculosis, making him the heir apparent of the Washington lands. Lawrence's only child, Sarah, died 2 months later and Washington became the head of one of Virginia's most prominent estates, Mount Vernon. He was 20 years old. Throughout his life, he would hold farming as one of the most honorable professions and he was most proud of Mount Vernon. Washington would gradually increase his landholdings there to about 8,000 acres. In the early 1750s, France and Britain were at peace. However, the French military had begun occupying much of the Ohio Valley, protecting the king's land interests, particularly fur trappers and French settlers. But the borderlands of this area were unclear and prone to dispute between the two countries. Washington showed early signs of natural leadership, and shortly after Lawrence's death, Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, appointed Washington adjutant with the rank of major in the Virginia militia. On October 31, 1753, Dinwiddie sent Washington to Fort Le Boeuf, at what is now Waterford, Pennsylvania, to warn the French to remove themselves from land claimed by Britain. The French politely refused and Washington made a hasty ride back to Williamsburg, Virginia's colonial capital. Dinwiddie sent Washington back with troops and they set up a post at Great Meadows. Washington's small force attacked a French post at Fort Duquesne, killing the commander, Coulon de Jumonville, and 9 others and taking the rest prisoners. The French and Indian War had begun. The French counterattacked and drove Washington and his men back to his post at Great Meadows, later named Fort Necessity. After a full-day siege, Washington surrendered and was soon released and returned to Williamsburg, promising not to build another fort on the Ohio River. Though a little embarrassed at being captured, he was grateful to receive the thanks from the House of Burgesses and see his name mentioned in the London Gazettes. Washington was given the honorary rank of colonel and joined British General Edward Braddock's army in Virginia in 1755. The British had devised a plan for a 3-pronged assault on French forces attacking Fort Duquesne, Fort Niagara and Crown Point. During the encounter, the French and their Indian allies ambushed Braddock, who was mortally wounded. Washington escaped injury with 4 bullet holes in his cloak and 2 horses shot out from under him. Though he fought bravely, he could do little to turn back the rout and led the defeated army back to safety. In August 1755, Washington was made commander of all Virginia troops at age 23. He was sent to the frontier to patrol and protect nearly 400 miles of border with some 700 ill-disciplined colonial troops and a Virginia colonial legislature unwilling to support him. It was a frustrating assignment. His health failed in the closing months of 1757 and he was sent home with dysentery. A month after leaving the army, Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a widow, who was only a few months older than him. Martha brought to the marriage a considerable fortune, an 18,000-acre estate, from which Washington personally acquired 6,000 acres. With this and land he was granted for his military service, Washington became one of the wealthier landowners in Virginia. The marriage also brought Martha's 2 young children, John and Martha, ages 6 and 4, respectively. Washington lavished great affection on both of them, and was heartbroken when Patsy died just before the Revolution. Jackie died during the Revolution, and Washington adopted 2 of his children. In 1758, Washington returned to duty on another expedition to capture Fort Duquesne. A friendly fire incident took place, killing 14 and wounding 26 of Washington's men. However, the British were able to score a major victory, capturing Fort Duquesne and control of the Ohio Valley. Washington retired from his Virginia regiment in December 1758. His experience during the war was generally frustrating, with key decisions made slowly, poor support from the colonial legislature and poorly trained recruits. Washington applied for a commission with the British Army but was turned down. In 1758, he resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon disillusioned. The same year, he entered politics and was elected to Virginia's House of Burgesses. During his retirement from the Virginia militia until the start of the Revolution, Washington devoted himself to the care and development of his landholdings, attending the rotation of crops, managing livestock and keeping up with the latest scientific advances. By the 1790s, Washington kept over 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon. He was said to dislike the institution of slavery, but accepted the fact that it was legal. George Washington's role in opposing the Stamp Act of 1765 was part of his early involvement in the resistance against British policies in the American colonies. The Stamp Act was a piece of legislation passed by the British Parliament that imposed a direct tax on the American colonies on various printed materials and paper goods, including newspapers, licenses, and legal documents. As a large landowner and a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, the Colonial Assembly of Virginia, Washington was directly affected by this law. The new taxes placed a financial burden on the colonists and increased tensions between the colonies and the British government, which sought to recoup the costs of the French and Indian War by taxing the colonies. Washington publicly and privately expressed his opposition to the Stamp Act. In his letters to friends and colleagues, he described the law as unjust and unconstitutional, arguing that it imposed taxes on the colonists without their consent or representation in the British Parliament. He believed that the imposition of taxes by a legislative body that the colonists had not elected violated their fundamental rights. Washington also participated in protest actions against the Stamp Act. In 1765, the Virginia House of Burgesses, of which Washington was a member, passed a series of resolutions known as the Virginia Resolves, introduced by Patrick Henry. These resolutions declared that the people of Virginia had the same rights as British citizens and should not be taxed without their consent. Washington supported these resolutions and helped promote them among his fellow legislators and colonists. Furthermore, Washington engaged in the boycott of British goods as a means of pressuring for the repeal of the act. He joined a group of planters and merchants who pledged not to import or use British products subject to the tax until the Stamp Act was repealed. This type of economic protest was effective in putting pressure on British merchants, who in turn urged the government to reconsider the policy. Under increasing pressure from the colonies and from British merchants affected by the boycott, the British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. The efforts of Washington and his fellow colonists played a significant role in achieving this outcome. Washington's opposition to the Stamp Act was an early step in his leadership in the movement against British rule, and this experience significantly influenced his later stances during the American Revolution. After the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the political dispute between Great Britain and her North American colonies escalated into an armed conflict. In May, Washington traveled to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia dressed in a military uniform, indicating that he was prepared for war. On June 15, he was appointed Major General and Commander-in-Chief of the colonial forces against Great Britain. As was his custom, he did not seek out the office of commander, but he faced no serious competition. Washington was the best choice for a number of reasons. He had the prestige, military experience and charisma for the job, and he had been advising Congress for months. Another factor was political. The revolution had started in New England, and at the time, they were the only colonies that had directly felt the brunt of British tyranny. Virginia was the largest British colony, and New England needed Southern colonial support. Political considerations and force of personality aside, Washington was not necessarily qualified to wage war on the world's most powerful nation. Washington's training and experience were primarily in frontier warfare involving small numbers of soldiers. He wasn't trained in the open field style of battle practiced by the commanding British generals. He also had no practical experience maneuvering large formations of infantry, commanding cavalry or artillery, or maintaining the flow of supplies for thousands of men in the field. But he was courageous and determined and smart enough to keep one step ahead of the enemy. Washington and his small army did taste victory early in March 1776 by placing artillery above Boston, on Dorchester Heights, forcing the British to withdraw. Washington then moved his troops into New York City. But in June, a new British commander, Sir William Howe, arrived in the colonies with the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever deployed to date. In August 1776, the British Army launched an attack and quickly took New York City in the largest battle of the war. Washington's army was routed and suffered the surrender of 2,800 men. He ordered the remains of his army to retreat into Pennsylvania across the Delaware River. Confident the war would be over in a few months, General Howe wintered his troops at Trenton and Princeton, leaving Washington free to attack at the time and place of his choosing. At that time, the morale of the Continental Army was low after a series of defeats and retreats. Washington realized that it was time for a bold move that would boost morale and restore confidence in the American cause. He decided to lead his army across the ice-choked Delaware River to execute a surprise attack on the Hessian forces. Washington planned to cross the river on Christmas night, hoping that the attack would be completely unexpected, as the Hessian forces were likely to be relaxed after holiday celebrations. The weather was extremely harsh, with snow, sleet, and freezing temperatures, making the crossing a daunting task. Despite the significant challenges, Washington led his army across the river using large transport boats. The crossing was perilous and difficult. with poor visibility and hazardous icy waters. Nevertheless, Washington and his soldiers successfully reached the other side. After the crossing, Washington led his army on a grueling march towards Trenton, arriving at dawn to launch a surprise attack on the Hessian forces. The battle was brief but decisive, with the Continental Army achieving a stunning victory, capturing more than 900 Hessian soldiers while suffering minimal losses. The crossing of the Delaware River and the Battle of Trenton had a profound impact on the course of the Revolutionary War. These victories significantly boosted the morale of the troops and the colonists in general, demonstrating that the Continental Army, under Washington's leadership, was capable of executing daring and successful operations against the British and their allies. These successes also helped attract more recruits to support the American cause and garnered greater support from the local population. In the spring of 1777, General Howe decided to launch a campaign to capture Philadelphia with the aim of demoralizing the colonists and disrupting the political connections among the colonies. Despite repeated warnings from George Washington and members of the Continental Congress, the Continental Army struggled to effectively counter the British forces. The British campaign began with capturing Continental Army outposts in New Jersey, followed by a move southward through the Chesapeake Bay towards Philadelphia. The Battle of Brandywine, which took place on September 11, 1777, was one of the decisive battles of this campaign. In that battle, the Continental Army, led by Washington, faced the British forces but suffered a significant defeat that forced them to retreat. After the defeat at Brandywine, Washington and his army withdrew northwest, while the British continued their advance towards Philadelphia. On September 26, 1777, British forces entered the city without significant resistance and quickly took control. The Continental Congress was forced to flee Philadelphia and relocate to York, Pennsylvania, to continue its work. The occupation of Philadelphia had a major impact on the morale of the colonists, but it was not as decisive as the British had hoped. Instead of breaking the independence movement, the fall of Philadelphia galvanized the Continental Army and the colonists. Washington and his army spent the winter at Valley Forge, where they underwent intensive training under Baron von Steuben, greatly enhancing their combat effectiveness. In the late summer of 1777, the British Army sent a major force, under the command of John Burgoyne, south from Quebec to Saratoga, New York, to split the rebellion between New England and the southern colonies. But the strategy backfired, as Burgoyne became trapped by the American armies led by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold at the Battle of Saratoga. Without support from Howe, who couldn't reach him in time, Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire 6,200-man army. The victory was a major turning point in the war as it encouraged France to openly ally itself with the American cause for independence. Through all of this, Washington discovered an important lesson: the political nature of war was just as important as the military one. Washington began to understand that military victories were as important as keeping the resistance alive. Americans began to believe that they could meet their objective of independence without defeating the British Army. Meanwhile, British General Howe clung to the strategy of capturing colonial cities in hopes of smothering the rebellion. Howe didn't realize that capturing cities like Philadelphia and New York would not unseat colonial power. The Congress would just pack up and meet elsewhere. Realizing their strategy of capturing colonial cities had failed, the British command replaced General Howe with Sir Henry Clinton. The British Army evacuated Philadelphia to return to New York City. Washington and his men delivered several quick blows to the moving army, attacking the British flank near Monmouth Courthouse. Though a tactical standoff, the encounter proved Washington's army capable of open-field battle. For the remainder of the war, Washington was content to keep the British confined to New York, although he never totally abandoned the idea of retaking the city. The alliance with France had brought a large French army and a navy fleet. Washington and his French counterparts decided to let Clinton be and attack British General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. Facing the combined French and colonial armies and the French fleet of 29 warships at his back, Cornwallis held out as long as he could, but on October 19, 1781, he surrendered his forces. Washington had no way of knowing the Yorktown victory would bring the war to a close. The British still had 26,000 troops occupying New York City, Charleston and Savannah, plus a large fleet of warships in the colonies. By 1782, the French army and navy had departed, the continental treasury was depleted, and most of his soldiers hadn't been paid for several years. A near mutiny was avoided when Washington convinced Congress to grant a 5-year bonus for soldiers in March 1783. By November of that year, the British had evacuated New York City and other cities, and the war was essentially over. The Americans had won their independence. Washington formally bade his troops farewell, and on December 23, 1783, he resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and returned to Mount Vernon. For 4 years, Washington attempted to fulfill his dream of resuming life as a gentleman farmer and to give his much-neglected Mount Vernon plantation the care and attention it deserved. The war had been costly to the Washington family, with lands neglected, no exports of goods, and the depreciation of paper money. But Washington was able to repair his fortunes with a generous land grant from Congress for his military service and become profitable once again. In 1787, Washington was again called to the duty of his country. Since independence, the young republic had been struggling under the Articles of Confederation, a structure of government that centered power with the states. But the states were not unified. They fought among themselves over boundaries and navigation rights and refused to contribute to paying off the nation's war debt. In some instances, state legislatures imposed tyrannical tax policies on their own citizens. Washington was intensely dismayed at the state of affairs, but only slowly came to the realization that something should be done about it. Perhaps he wasn't sure the time was right so soon after the Revolution to be making major adjustments to the democratic experiment. Or perhaps because he hoped he would not be called upon to serve, he remained non-committal. But when Shays' Rebellion erupted in Massachusetts, Washington knew something needed to be done to improve the nation's government. In 1786, Congress approved a convention to be held in Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation. At the Constitutional Convention, Washington was unanimously chosen as president. Washington, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton had come to the conclusion that it wasn't amendments that were needed, but a new constitution that would give the national government more authority. In the end, the convention produced a plan for government that not only would address the country's current problems, but would endure through time. After the convention adjourned, Washington's reputation and support for the new government were indispensable to the ratification of the new U.S. Constitution. The opposition was strident, if not organized, with many of America's leading political figures, including Patrick Henry and Sam Adams, condemning the proposed government as a grab for power. Even in Washington's native Virginia, the Constitution was ratified by only one vote. Still hoping to retire to his beloved Mount Vernon, Washington was once again called upon to serve this country. During the presidential election of 1789, he received a vote from every elector to the Electoral College, the only president in American history to be elected by unanimous approval. He took the oath of office at Federal Hall in New York City, the capital of the United States at the time. As the first president, Washington was astutely aware that his presidency would set a precedent for all that would follow. He carefully attended to the responsibilities and duties of his office, remaining vigilant to not emulate any European royal court. To that end, he preferred the title, Mr. President, instead of more imposing names that were suggested. At first he declined the $25,000 salary Congress offered the office of the presidency, for he was already wealthy and wanted to protect his image as a selfless public servant. However, Congress persuaded him to accept the compensation to avoid giving the impression that only wealthy men could serve as president. Washington proved to be an able administrator. He surrounded himself with some of the most capable people in the country, appointing Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. He delegated authority wisely and consulted regularly with his cabinet, listening to their advice before making a decision. Washington established broad-ranging presidential authority, but always with the highest integrity, exercising power with restraint and honesty. In doing so, he set a standard rarely met by his successors, but one that established an ideal by which all are judged. During his first term, Washington adopted a series of measures proposed by Treasury Secretary Hamilton to reduce the nation's debt and place its finances on sound footing. His administration also established several peace treaties with Native American tribes and approved a bill establishing the nation's capital in a permanent district along the Potomac River. Then, in 1791, Washington signed a bill authorizing Congress to place a tax on distilled spirits, which stirred protests in rural areas of Pennsylvania. Quickly, the protests turned into a full-scale defiance of federal law known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington invoked the Militia Act of 1792, summoning local militias from several states to put down the rebellion. Washington personally took command, marching the troops into the areas of rebellion and demonstrating that the federal government would use force, when necessary, to enforce the law. This was also the only time a sitting U.S. president has led troops into battle. In foreign affairs, Washington took a cautious approach, realizing that the weak young nation could not succumb to Europe's political intrigues. In 1793, France and Great Britain were once again at war. At the urging of Hamilton, Washington disregarded the U.S. alliance with France and pursued a course of neutrality. In 1794, he sent John Jay to Britain to negotiate a treaty, known as the Jay Treaty, to secure a peace with Britain and clear up some issues held over from the Revolutionary War. The action infuriated Jefferson, who supported the French and felt that the U.S. needed to honor its treaty obligations. Washington was able to mobilize public support for the treaty, which proved decisive in securing ratification in the Senate. Though controversial, the treaty proved beneficial to the United States by removing British forts along the western frontier, establishing a clear boundary between Canada and the United States, and most importantly, delaying a war with Britain and providing over a decade of prosperous trade and development the fledgling country so desperately needed. All through his 2 terms as president, Washington was dismayed at the growing partisanship within the government and the nation. The power bestowed on the federal government by the Constitution made for important decisions, and people joined together to influence those decisions. The formation of political parties at first were influenced more by personality than by issues. As Treasury Secretary, Hamilton pushed for a strong national government and an economy built in industry. Secretary of State Jefferson desired to keep government small and center power more at the local level, where citizens' freedom could be better protected. He envisioned an economy based on farming. Those who followed Hamilton's vision took the name Federalists, and people who opposed those ideas and tended to lean toward Jefferson's view began calling themselves Democratic Republicans. Washington despised political partisanship, believing that ideological differences should never become institutionalized. He strongly felt that political leaders should be free to debate important issues without being bound by party loyalty. However, Washington could do little to slow the development of political parties. The ideals promoted by Hamilton and Jefferson produced a 2-party system that proved remarkably durable. These opposing viewpoints represented a continuation of the debate over the proper role of government, a debate that began with the conception of the Constitution and continues today. Washington's administration was not without its critics who questioned what they saw as extravagant conventions in the office of the president. During his 2 terms, Washington rented the best houses available and was driven in a coach drawn by 4 horses, with outriders and lackeys in rich uniforms. After being overwhelmed by callers, he announced that except for the scheduled weekly reception open to all, he would only see people by appointment. Washington entertained lavishly, but in private dinners and receptions at invitation only. He was, by some, accused of conducting himself like a king. However, ever mindful his presidency would set the precedent for those to follow, he was careful to avoid the trappings of a monarchy. At public ceremonies, he did not appear in a military uniform or the monarchical robes. Instead, He dressed in a black velvet suit with gold buckles and powdered hair, as was the common custom. His reserved manner was more due to inherent reticence than any excessive sense of dignity. Desiring to return to Mount Vernon and his farming, and feeling the decline of his physical powers with age, Washington refused to yield to the pressures to serve a third term, even though he would probably not have faced any opposition. By doing this, he was again mindful of the precedent of being the first president, and chose to establish a peaceful transition of government. In the last months of his presidency, Washington felt he needed to give his country one last measure of himself. With the help of Hamilton, he composed his farewell address to the American people, which urged his fellow citizens to cherish the Union and avoid partisanship and permanent foreign alliances. In March 1797, he turned over the government to John Adams and returned to Mount Vernon, determined to live his last years as a simple gentleman farmer. His last official act was to pardon the participants in the Whiskey Rebellion. Upon returning to Mount Vernon in the spring of 1797, Washington felt a reflective sense of relief and accomplishment. He had left the government in capable hands, at peace, its debts well managed, and set on a course of prosperity. He devoted much of his time to tending the farm's operations and management. Although he was perceived to be wealthy, his landholdings were only marginally profitable. On a cold December day in 1799, Washington spent much of it inspecting the farm on horseback in a driving snowstorm. When he returned home, he hastily ate his supper in his wet clothes and then went to bed. The next morning, on December 13th, he awoke with a severe sore throat and became increasingly hoarse. He retired early, but awoke around 3 a.m. and told Martha that he felt very sick. The illness progressed until he died late in the evening of December 14, 1799. The news of Washington's death at age 67 spread throughout the country, plunging the nation into a deep mourning. Many towns and cities held mock funerals and presented hundreds of eulogies to honor their fallen hero. When the news of this death reached Europe, the British fleet paid tribute to his memory, and Napoleon ordered 10 days of mourning. Washington could have been a king. Instead, he chose to be a citizen. He set many precedents for the national government and the presidency. The two-term limit in office, only broken once by Franklin D. Roosevelt, was later ensconced in the Constitution's 22nd Amendment. He crystallized the power of the presidency as a part of the government's three branches of government, able to exercise authority when necessary, but also accept the checks and balances of power inherent in the system. He was not only considered a military and revolutionary hero, but a man of great personal integrity, with a deep sense of duty, honor and patriotism. For over 200 years, Washington has been acclaimed as indispensable to the success of the Revolution and the birth of the nation. But his most important legacy may be that he insisted he was dispensable, asserting that the cause of liberty was larger than any single individual. Benjamin Franklin was born on January 17, 1706, in Boston, Massachusetts. His father, Josiah Franklin, was a soap and candle maker, and his mother, Abia Folger, was Josiah's second wife. Benjamin was the 15th of 17 children in the large Franklin family. Growing up in a bustling household, he learned the values of hard work and perseverance from an early age. Franklin began his formal education at the age of 8 when he attended the Boston Latin School. However, his schooling lasted only 2 years due to the family's financial difficulties. Despite his limited formal education, Franklin had an insatiable appetite for learning and continued his education through extensive reading. He read every book he could get his hands on, which helped him acquire a broad knowledge in various fields. At the age of 10, Franklin had to leave school and work in his father's soap and candle shop. However, he found the work uninteresting and sought other opportunities. Recognizing his son's curiosity and passion for learning, Josiah decided to send Benjamin to work with his older brother James, who was a printer. At 12 years old, Franklin began his apprenticeship in his brother James' printing shop. This period was crucial in his life, as he learned a great deal about the printing trade and acquired new skills in writing and editing. Benjamin began writing articles for his brother's newspaper, the New England Courant, under the pseudonym Silence Doggett. These articles gained widespread popularity among readers due to their humorous and insightful style. Despite his professional success at his brother's print shop, Franklin's relationship with James was strained. James was strict and often harsh in his treatment of Benjamin, leading to frequent conflicts between them. In 1723, at the age of 17, Franklin decided to run away from Boston to seek new opportunities in Philadelphia. After running away from his brother in Boston at the age of 17, Benjamin Franklin headed to Philadelphia, a city that would become the stage for many of his achievements. He arrived in Philadelphia in October 1723 after a challenging journey, starting his new life with no money or resources to speak of. Nevertheless, he quickly found work at the print shop of Samuel Keimer, a local printer, where he began to build his reputation as a diligent and talented worker. Franklin was a young man full of ambition, always striving to improve himself and develop his skills. In 1724, he was persuaded to travel to London by Pennsylvania Governor Sir William Keith, who promised to support him in purchasing the equipment needed to start his own printing business. However, upon arriving in London, Franklin discovered that Keith had not provided the promised financial support, forcing him to find work there to survive. In London, Franklin worked for Samuel Palmer's printing house on Bartholomew Close, where he gained valuable experience in printing and publishing. He also worked for a time at John Watt's printing shop, further enhancing his skills and knowledge in the field. Life in London was challenging for Franklin at first, as he faced financial difficulties and had to work hard to cover his expenses. In addition to his printing work, Franklin took advantage of his time in London to expand his knowledge through reading and attending lectures and seminars. He enjoyed immersing himself in the cultural and intellectual life of London, where he met many educated individuals and learned through discussions and debates with them. During his time in London, Franklin wrote several articles and publications that reflected his diverse interests and passion for learning. He also acquired new skills in business management and economics, which later helped him in his business ventures in Philadelphia. Although Franklin enjoyed his life in London, he began to feel the need to return to Philadelphia to pursue his business projects there. In 1726, after spending about 18 months in London, he decided to return to Philadelphia to establish his own career. After his return to Philadelphia in 1726, Franklin held varied jobs including bookkeeper, shopkeeper and currency cutter. In 1728 he returned to a familiar trade, printing paper currency, in New Jersey before partnering with a friend to open his own print shop in Philadelphia that published government pamphlets and books. In 1730 Franklin was named the official printer of Pennsylvania. By that time, he had formed the Junto, a social and self-improvement study group for young men that met every Friday to debate morality, philosophy and politics. When Junto members sought to expand their reading choices, Franklin helped to incorporate America's first subscription library, the Library Company of Philadelphia, in 1731. In 1729 Franklin published another pamphlet, A Modest Inquiry into the Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency, which advocated for an increase in the money supply to stimulate the economy. With the cash Franklin earned from his money-related treatise, he was able to purchase the Pennsylvania Gazette newspaper from a former boss. Under his ownership, the struggling newspaper was transformed into the most widely read paper in the colonies and became one of the first to turn a profit. He had less luck in 1732 when he launched the first German-language newspaper in the colonies, the short-lived Philadelphische Zeitung. Nonetheless, Franklin's prominence and success grew during the 1730s. Franklin amassed real estate and businesses and organized the Volunteer Union Fire Company to counteract dangerous fire hazards in Philadelphia. He joined the Freemasons in 1731 and was eventually elected Grand Master of the Masons of Pennsylvania. Benjamin Franklin's marital life was complex and unconventional. In 1730, he entered into a common-law marriage with Deborah Reed. Their relationship was unique and reflected the practical and pragmatic sides of Franklin's character. Franklin had first met Deborah Reed in 1723 when he arrived in Philadelphia. At that time, she was the daughter of his landlady. Franklin had shown interest in her, but their courtship was interrupted when he traveled to London. During his absence, Deborah married John Rogers, a union that soon turned problematic. Rogers proved to be an unreliable and irresponsible husband, eventually abandoning Deborah and fleeing to the West Indies. When Franklin returned to Philadelphia in 1726, Deborah was unable to remarry legally due to the uncertain status of her first husband. Despite this, Franklin and Deborah began living together in a common-law marriage in 1730. The union produced two children, Frances Folger Franklin, born in 1732, and Sarah Franklin, known as Sally, born in 1743. Unfortunately, Frances died of smallpox at the age of 4, a loss that deeply affected both parents. Deborah was a steadfast partner to Franklin, managing their household and businesses while he pursued his many interests and responsibilities. She helped run their print shop and the general store they operated, contributing significantly to the family's financial stability. Despite her lack of formal education, Deborah was resourceful and capable, ensuring the family's well-being during Franklin's frequent absences. Franklin's relationship with Deborah was marked by long separations, particularly during his extended stays in London and later in Paris, where he served as a diplomat. Despite his absence, the couple maintained a correspondence that showed mutual respect and concern, although Franklin's letters sometimes revealed his frustration with Deborah's reluctance to join him abroad. Deborah had a fear of sea travel, which kept her from accompanying him. During Franklin's extended periods away from home, he developed relationships with other women. His flirtations and possible romantic involvements, particularly with women in France, were known but never officially documented in detail. In addition to his common-law marriage with Deborah, Franklin had an illegitimate son, William Franklin, born around 1730. The identity of William's mother remains unknown. Franklin raised William as part of his family, and William went on to become the last colonial governor of New Jersey. Benjamin Franklin's creation of Paul Richards' Almanac was a significant milestone in his career as a publisher and author. He first issued the almanac in 1732 under the pseudonym Richard Saunders. His goal was to provide practical advice and wisdom that people could use in their daily lives. Paul Richards' Almanac was more than just a traditional calendar with dates and days of the week. It contained a variety of information related to weather, agriculture, astronomy, home remedies, as well as short sayings and proverbs meant to offer guidance on ethics and hard work. The almanac quickly became popular among the American colonists, offering them valuable information in an entertaining and engaging format. The almanac was not just a collection of dates and proverbs. It was also an educational tool providing practical advice to help individuals improve their daily lives. It included sayings and proverbs that became famous over the years, such as, "Time is money," and "Don't put off until tomorrow what you can do today," which are still widely quoted today. During King George's War, 1744 to 1748, also known as the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe, Benjamin Franklin played a significant role in organizing the defense of the American colonies, despite not participating directly in combat. The war was part of a series of conflicts between Britain and France, with their respective Native American allies, which impacted the North American colonies. In 1747, as threats from French and Native American attacks grew, Franklin called upon the citizens of Philadelphia to form a militia to defend the colony. He wrote a pamphlet titled Plain Truth, in which he outlined his ideas for organizing local militias and securing the colonies against attacks. This pamphlet had a considerable impact and led to the formation of local militias. Additionally, Franklin was a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly, a group of prominent citizens working to improve both civilian and military defenses. Through his efforts, funds and weapons were raised to equip the local militias in and around Philadelphia. Although Franklin was not a soldier or a military leader, his contributions to organizing civilian defenses and encouraging collective action were of great importance. His efforts helped foster a spirit of cooperation and community involvement in addressing external threats, leading to enhanced security and stability in the colonies. In the 1740s, Franklin expanded into science and entrepreneurship. His 1743 pamphlet, A Proposal for Promoting Useful Knowledge, underscored his interests and served as the founding document of the American Philosophical Society, the first scientific society in the colonies. By 1748, the 42-year-old Franklin had become one of the richest men in Pennsylvania, and he became a soldier in the Pennsylvania militia. He turned his printing business over to a partner to give himself more time to conduct scientific experiments. He moved into a new house in 1748. Benjamin Franklin is renowned for his pioneering experiments and discoveries in the field of electricity. His work laid the groundwork for modern electrical science. Here are some of his notable inventions and contributions. Lightning rod. Franklin's most famous invention related to electricity is the lightning rod. He theorized that lightning is a form of electricity and proposed that a pointed metal rod mounted on the roof of a building could draw lightning and safely direct it to the ground, preventing fires and other damage. The kite experiment. Franklin's kite experiment in 1752 is one of the most well-known events in the history of science. During a thunderstorm, he flew a kite with a metal key attached to the string. When lightning struck the kite, the electrical charge traveled down the string and produced sparks when it reached the key, proving that lightning is a form of electricity. This experiment validated his theory and significantly advanced the understanding of electricity. Electrical terms. Franklin introduced several terms still used in electrical science today, including battery, conductor, charge, and discharge. He was the first to use the terms positive and negative to describe the polarity of electrical charges. His ability to clearly explain complex phenomena helped make the study of electricity more accessible. Franklin's bells. One of Franklin's lesser-known inventions is an early warning system for electrical storms called Franklin's bells. This device consisted of two metal bells connected to a lightning rod. When an electrical storm approached, the bells would ring, indicating the presence of atmospheric electrical charges. This invention was another practical application of his understanding of electricity. Leyden jar improvements. Franklin also improved the design of the Leyden jar, an early form of a capacitor used to store electrical charge. His modifications made the device more efficient and safer to use, facilitating further experiments and practical applications of stored electrical energy. Franklin's experiments with electricity were groundbreaking and earned him international recognition. His practical inventions, like the lightning rod, had immediate benefits for society, reducing the risk of lightning damage. His theoretical contributions laid the foundation for the future study of electricity, making him one of the most influential figures in the history of electrical science. Franklin was a prolific inventor and scientist who was responsible for the following inventions. Franklin's stove. Franklin's first invention, created around 1740, provided more heat with less fuel. Bifocals. Anyone tired of switching between two pairs of glasses understands why Franklin developed bifocals that could be used for both distance and reading. Harmonica. Franklin's inventions took on a musical bent when, in 1761, he commenced development on the harmonica, a musical instrument composed of spinning glass bowls on a shaft. Both Ludwig van Beethoven and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart composed music for the strange instrument. Rocking chair. Flexible catheter. American penny. Franklin also discovered the Gulf Stream after his return trip across the Atlantic Ocean from London in 1775. He began to speculate about why the westbound trip always took longer, and his measurements of ocean temperatures led to his discovery of the existence of the Gulf Stream. This knowledge served to cut 2 weeks off the previous sailing time from Europe to North America. Franklin's self-education earned him honorary degrees from Harvard, Yale, England's University of Oxford and the University of St Andrews in Scotland. In 1749, Franklin wrote a pamphlet concerning the education of youth in Pennsylvania that resulted in the establishment of the Academy of Philadelphia, now the University of Pennsylvania. Franklin became a member of Philadelphia's City Council in 1748 and a Justice of the Peace the following year. In 1751, he was elected a Philadelphia alderman and a representative to the Pennsylvania Assembly, a position to which he was re-elected annually until 1764. 2 years later, he accepted a royal appointment as Deputy Postmaster General of North America. When the French and Indian War began in 1754, Franklin called on the colonies to band together for their common defense, which he dramatized in the Pennsylvania Gazette with a cartoon of a snake cut into sections with the caption, "Join or Die." He represented Pennsylvania at the Albany Congress, which adopted his proposal to create a unified government for the 13 colonies. Franklin's Plan of Union, however, failed to be ratified by the colonies. In 1757, Franklin was appointed by the Pennsylvania Assembly to serve as the colony's agent in England. Franklin sailed to London to negotiate a long-standing dispute with the proprietors of the colony, the Penn family, taking William and his 2 enslaved people but leaving behind Deborah and Sarah. He spent much of the next 2 decades in London, where he was drawn to the high society and intellectual salons of the cosmopolitan city. In the 1750s, the Pennsylvania colony was facing substantial problems with its proprietors, the Penn family, concerning issues related to governance, taxation, and defense. The Penn family held significant authority over the colony but did not pay their fair share of taxes or contribute adequately to its defense. Due to these issues, Franklin was sent to London in 1757 as a representative to advocate for the colony's interests and attempt to resolve the conflict. During his stay in London, Franklin worked diligently to negotiate with the Penn family and the British Parliament. He encountered strong resistance from the Penn family, who were unwilling to relinquish any of their power. Despite his efforts, Franklin was unable to secure a completely satisfactory settlement, but he did succeed in drawing the British Parliament's attention to the colony's problems. In London, Franklin became a well-known and respected figure, engaging in scientific, literary, and social activities. He joined the Royal Society and formed friendships with many prominent British personalities. He also served as a representative for several other colonies in addition to Pennsylvania, which expanded his influence. During Franklin's time in London, the situation in Pennsylvania was changing. The colonists began to feel increased pressure from British taxes and interference in their affairs. In 1764, while Franklin was still in London, a new assembly was elected in Pennsylvania. There was growing opposition to his policies and his association with the Penn family, which ultimately led to his losing his seat in the Pennsylvania Assembly. His loss of the seat was part of a broader shift in colonial politics, as the American colonies began moving toward greater opposition to British rule and the eventual push for independence. Despite this setback, Franklin continued to play a crucial role in politics and international affairs. After Franklin lost his seat in the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1764, he returned to London as the colony's agent. Franklin returned at a tense time in Great Britain's relations with the American colonies. The British Parliament's passage of the Stamp Act in March 1765 imposed a highly unpopular tax on all printed materials for commercial and legal use in the American colonies. Since Franklin purchased stamps for his printing business and nominated a friend as the Pennsylvania stamp distributor, some colonists thought Franklin implicitly supported the new tax, and rioters in Philadelphia even threatened his house. Franklin's passionate denunciation of the tax in testimony before Parliament, however, contributed to the Stamp Act's repeal in 1766. 2 years later he penned a pamphlet, Causes of the American Discontents, before 1768, and he soon became an agent for Massachusetts, Georgia and New Jersey as well. Franklin fanned the flames of revolution by sending the private letters of Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson to America. The letters called for the restriction of the rights of colonists, which caused a firestorm after their publication by Boston newspapers. In the wake of the scandal, Franklin was removed as Deputy Postmaster General, and he returned to North America in 1775 as a devotee of the Patriot cause. In 1775, Franklin was elected to the Second Continental Congress and appointed the first Postmaster General for the colonies. In 1776, he was appointed Commissioner to Canada and was one of 5 men to draft the Declaration of Independence. Following the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress sent Franklin to France on a vital diplomatic mission. His primary objective was to secure French military and financial support for the American Revolution. Franklin arrived in France in December 1776 and quickly became a beloved and influential figure at the French court. With his charm, wit, and social connections, he managed to win the favor of many prominent figures in French society. In 1778, Franklin signed the Treaty of Alliance and the Treaty of Amity and Commerce with France, making France the first country to officially recognize the independence of the United States and provide essential military and financial support for the American cause. This alliance had a significant impact on the course of the Revolutionary War, as the French provided troops, supplies, and a navy that were crucial to the American victory. Franklin remained in France until the end of the war, participating in the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially ended the war and recognized the independence of the United States. His role in these negotiations was pivotal, as he managed to secure favorable terms for the new nation. After returning to the United States in 1785, Franklin continued his public service. He was elected President of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, a position he held until 1788. He also took part in the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where he contributed to the drafting of the United States Constitution. Despite his advanced age and declining health, Franklin played a significant role in the convention's debates and sought to achieve consensus among the differing views. The oldest delegate at the age of 81, Franklin initially supported proportional representation in Congress, but he fashioned the Great Compromise that resulted in proportional representation in the House of Representatives and equal representation by state in the Senate. In 1787, he helped found the Society for Political Inquiries, dedicated to improving knowledge of government. Franklin was never elected President of the United States. However, he played an important role as one of 8 founding fathers, helping draft the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. He also served several roles in the government. He was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly and appointed as the first Postmaster General for the colonies as well as diplomat to France. He was a true polymath and entrepreneur, which is no doubt why he is often called the first American. Benjamin Franklin passed away on April 17, 1790, at the age of 84 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His health had been declining for several years, and he suffered from ailments such as gout and kidney stones. Despite his physical ailments, Franklin remained intellectually active and engaged in public life until his final days. Franklin's death marked the end of a life filled with remarkable achievements and contributions to the fields of science, politics, diplomacy, and literature. His passing was widely mourned in both America and Europe. In recognition of his significant impact, over 20,000 people attended his funeral in Philadelphia. He was laid to rest in Christ Church Burial Ground in Philadelphia, where his grave remains a site of historical importance and public interest. Franklin's legacy continued to grow posthumously. His autobiography, numerous scientific discoveries, and prolific writings have cemented his place as one of the most influential figures in American history. John Adams was born on October 30, 1735, in Braintree, Massachusetts, a town located just south of Boston with views of Boston Harbor. His father, John Adams Sr., was a farmer and deacon who also worked as a shoemaker and local tax collector. The Adams family traced its roots back to Henry Adams, John's great-grandfather, who immigrated to Massachusetts from Braintree, Essex, England, in 1638. Henry established the first colonial settlement in Braintree, Massachusetts, naming it after his hometown in England. John Adams Sr. achieved moderate affluence, enabling him to purchase a farmstead in Quincy, though the family was not considered especially wealthy. John's mother, Susanna Boylston, came from a prominent family in Brookline, Massachusetts, and married John Adams Sr. in 1734. John was their first child, followed by his brothers Peter in 1738 and Elihu in 1741. Adams' childhood reflected the middle-class upbringing typical of colonial Massachusetts in the mid-18th century. He attended a mixed-gender school where the primary educational material was the New England Primer**, a textbook first published in the late 1680s. This text focused on instilling Puritan religious values while teaching basic literacy skills. However, it offered little in the way of intellectual development. Upon completing his elementary education, Adams advanced to Braintree Latin School. Here he embarked on a classical humanist education, studying Latin, rhetoric, logic, philosophy, and arithmetic. The curriculum was also influenced by the scientific advancements of the Enlightenment era. Though Adams excelled academically, his rebellious and questioning nature often caused conflicts during his time at the Latin School, traits that would later make him well-suited for revolutionary leadership. Adams' early years unfolded during a period when America was vastly different from the nation it would become. In the mid-18th century, the eastern coast of North America was dominated by British, French, and Spanish colonies. The Spanish controlled Florida, while the French governed New France, which roughly corresponds to present-day eastern Canada. The British had established colonies between these territories, starting with Virginia and New England in the early 17th century, and expanded to form 13 distinct colonies by Adams' time. These colonies were categorized into 3 regions. New England, where Adams was born, included New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, with Boston as its economic hub. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were the most diverse in terms of ethnicity and religion and were gaining economic prominence due to the growth of cities like New York and Philadelphia. The southern colonies, including Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, were largely rural and focused on cash crops like tobacco and cotton, resulting in a significant reliance on enslaved labor. All 13 colonies were under British control, with colonists paying taxes to the Crown despite lacking political representation in Britain, issues that would eventually lead to widespread unrest. However, in the 1750s, revolution was far from John Adams' mind as he focused on becoming a distinguished scholar. In 1751, John Adams began attending Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the oldest institution of higher learning in North America. It was here that he developed a strong interest in the works of great Greek and Roman authors, particularly historians such as Thucydides, Livy, and Tacitus, as well as the rhetorical and political writings of Cicero and Quintilian. He was also greatly influenced by the political, philosophical, and cultural writings emerging from the European Enlightenment, which addressed the concepts of political liberty and representation in response to the absolutist monarchies of countries like Russia and France during the pre-revolutionary Ancien regime. A particularly impactful work in this regard was The Spirit of the Laws*, published by Charles Louis II at Baron de Montesquieu in 1748. The book was quickly translated into English in 1750. And its arguments on political liberty and the rights of citizens before the law became a significant influence on some of the American founding fathers, including Adams, in the 1750s and 1760s. Adams' interest in the law deepened significantly during this time. After earning his Bachelor of Arts degree from Harvard in 1754, he swiftly began studying law, earning a Master of Arts degree from Harvard in 1758. In 1759, at just 24 years old, he was admitted to the bar. Around the same time he was completing his graduate studies and preparing to practice law, Adams began courting his third cousin, Abigail Smith. Their courtship was relatively slow by the standards of the time, and Adams did not propose until several years later. Consequently, they were not married until October 1764. Their relationship was based on mutual respect, and Abigail often served as a moderating influence on John, who, while respected for his honor by his political peers, was sometimes seen as inflexible and even arrogant. The couple settled on Adams' 9.5-acre farm in Quincy, just outside Braintree, which he had inherited after his father's death in 1761. Adams began building a successful legal career, one that was founded on his growing reputation for intellectual rigor and legal expertise in Boston. He and Abigail soon started a family, with their first child, a daughter named Abigail after her mother, born in 1765. They would have 5 more children: John Quincy in 1767, Susanna in 1768, Charles in 1770, Thomas in 1772, and Elizabeth in 1777. Tragically, 2 of the younger daughters did not survive. Susanna passed away in infancy in 1769, and Elizabeth was stillborn. While John Adams was pursuing his studies, establishing his law career, the 13 colonies were caught in the turbulence of global conflict. In 1756, Britain and France entered into the 7 Years' War *, often regarded as the first global war, involving battles across Europe, the Americas, and Asia between the 2 primary belligerents and their allies. The conflict stemmed from long-standing Anglo-French rivalries, fueled further by territorial disputes between British colonies and French holdings in New France, Canada, and Louisiana. Although many British colonists fought in the war, Adams did not participate, as he was still a student at Harvard when hostilities began. Nonetheless, the war significantly affected him and other colonial subjects. Britain emerged victorious in 1763, acquiring Canada from France under the Peace of Paris. This victory came largely through the support and sacrifices of the colonial community. Many in the 13 colonies hoped that their contributions would result in greater political representation within the British government. However, they were soon disillusioned when London responded by imposing heavier taxation on the colonies to recoup the war's costs, sparking widespread resentment and beginning the radicalization of figures like Adams. During this period, Adams' political inclinations started to take shape, and he began voicing his opinions through writing. Using the pseudonym Humphrey Plowjogger, Adams contributed to the Boston Evening Post. Adopting the guise of a plain-speaking New England farmer, he criticized certain political stances taken by influential Bostonians who published in outlets like the Boston Gazette. While Adams shared concerns about British overreach, he advocated for a measured approach, suggesting that colonial administrators should be judged by their actions rather than their affiliation with the Crown. His writings demonstrated a growing commitment to defending colonial rights, yet he had not fully embraced the idea of severing ties with Britain. Instead, Adams sought a balance between challenging unwarranted British interference and maintaining allegiance to the Crown. This cautious yet critical stance would evolve as Adams and the colonies faced escalating tensions with the British government in the coming years. The Stamp Act of 1765 was a pivotal moment in the increasing tensions between Britain and its colonies. This decree required that all printed materials in the 13 colonies, including newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards, carry a revenue stamp, symbolizing a tax paid to the British government. The rationale behind the act was to recoup expenses from the 7 Years' War, a conflict that Britain argued had been fought to protect its American colonies from French invasion. However, the act was deeply unpopular in the colonies, as it represented taxation without representation. John Adams emerged as a vocal critic of the Stamp Act. Writing under his pseudonym, Humphrey Plowjogger, he published articles opposing the act and authored the Braintree Instructions, a formal statement outlining his objections. Adams argued that the taxation was inequitable, as it did not mirror the taxes levied on subjects in Britain. The widespread colonial outrage forced the British government to repeal the Stamp Act in March 1766. This marked one of the first instances of Adams publicly positioning himself against British policies in Massachusetts. By the late 1760s, Adams had relocated his family to Boston and established himself as a leading lawyer. His opposition to British policies continued, particularly against the Townshend Acts of 1767 and 1768, which imposed new taxes on goods imported to the colonies. Despite his criticisms, Adams also demonstrated a commitment to legal fairness and impartiality. This was most evident following the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770, when British soldiers fired on a mob in Boston, killing 5 individuals. Amid the widespread outrage, Adams agreed to defend the accused soldiers in court, arguing that they deserved a fair trial despite the public fury. His skilled legal defense led to the acquittal of Captain Thomas Preston and most of the soldiers involved. Adams' reputation grew further when he was elected to the Massachusetts legislature in the months following the Boston Massacre. However, his disillusionment with British rule deepened with the passage of the Tea Act in 1773. The act aimed to curb the smuggling of Dutch tea into the colonies and force Americans to buy surplus tea from the British East India Company. The act's implementation enraged colonists, culminating in the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773. That night, protesters boarded the Dartmouth, a British ship docked in Boston Harbor, and dumped 342 crates of tea valued at nearly $2 million today into the harbor. Adams celebrated the Boston Tea Party *, calling it one of the grandest events in the history of colonial resistance. This act of defiance, combined with Britain's increasingly punitive measures, convinced Adams that peaceful negotiation with the Crown was no longer viable. By 1773, Adams had become a committed advocate for revolutionary action, marking a turning point in his political career and the broader movement toward American independence. The early to mid-1770s were transformative years for John Adams, as his political ideology hardened in response to British policies that increasingly appeared overbearing and tyrannical. Events such as the Tea Act, the direct payment of judges' salaries by the British government, and the punitive naval blockade of Boston Harbor following the Boston Tea Party radicalized Adams. These actions by Westminster convinced him, and many others, that the Crown's intent was to erode colonial autonomy and impose authoritarian control. Adams became a pivotal figure in the First Continental Congress in 1774, which convened in response to these perceived injustices. He navigated the diverse viewpoints among the 56 delegates, from radicals advocating immediate revolution to moderates seeking reconciliation. Through Adams' ability to mediate and compromise, the Congress adopted the Continental Association, a collective agreement to boycott British trade as a means of pressuring London for concessions. Petitions were also sent to King George III, outlining the colony's grievances and seeking redress. The British government's response to these measures was unequivocal and hostile. In early 1775, Parliament declared the colonies to be in rebellion and instructed the military to disarm colonial militias. The situation escalated on April 19, 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord, marking the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. Adams, now fully convinced of the need for independence, took a leading role in advocating for organized resistance and governmental formation at the Second Continental Congress, which convened in May 1775. During the summer of 1775, Adams was instrumental in the establishment of the Continental Army. Recognizing the need for a professional and unified military force, he strongly supported the appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief. This strategic decision helped to unify the colonies, particularly by securing the support of the southern colonies through the appointment of a Virginian leader. While Adams signed the Olive Branch Petition, a final appeal for reconciliation sent to King George III in July 1775, he viewed it as futile. The petition's rejection and the Crown's formal declaration of rebellion in August cemented Adams' belief that independence was the only viable path forward. The remainder of 1775 and the early months of 1776 saw Adams and his fellow delegates at the Second Continental Congress laying the groundwork for an independent American government, grappling with the monumental tasks of raising revenue, organizing military efforts, and establishing the administrative framework of a nascent nation. This pivotal period highlighted Adams' indispensable role as a unifying and pragmatic leader in the revolutionary movement, setting the stage for the formal Declaration of Independence in July 1776. By the early summer of 1776, John Adams stood at the forefront of the revolutionary movement as the momentum for independence reached its zenith. The ongoing intensification of the war and the unwavering hostility from the British Crown and Parliament left little room for reconciliation. The decision to formally declare independence became inevitable. Adams was selected as one of 5 members of a committee tasked with drafting the Declaration of Independence, alongside Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Although Jefferson was the primary author, Adams played a significant role in shaping the document, providing critical suggestions and collaborating closely with Jefferson and Franklin to refine its content. This collaboration marked the beginning of a complex and enduring relationship between Adams and Jefferson, defined by both camaraderie and rivalry. On July 4, 1776, after fervent debates, Adams passionately defended the Declaration before the Continental Congress, leading to its ratification. The United States of America was officially born, but its independence would only become a reality through continued military struggle. In the war's early years, Adams emerged as an indispensable figure in the Second Continental Congress. Between 1775 and 1778, the conflict focused heavily on New England and the Middle Colonies. The Patriots achieved a significant victory by capturing Boston in 1776, but the British countered by seizing New York City later that year and Philadelphia in 1777. The tide of war shifted dramatically in October 1777 with the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga. This pivotal battle not only demoralized British forces but also convinced France to formally ally with the Patriots, providing critical military and economic support. Adams' contributions during this period were monumental. As a senior member of Congress, he participated in 90 committees and chaired more than 24. Appointed in June 1776, Adams became responsible for ensuring the Continental Army was properly equipped with weapons, ammunition, and other supplies. His meticulous attention to logistics and relentless work ethic, often putting in 18-hour days, proved crucial in sustaining the war effort. Adams spearheaded efforts to establish strong ties with European powers like France, the Dutch Republic, and Prussia. He played a key role in drafting the Model Treaty, a blueprint for commercial agreements between the United States and foreign nations. This work laid the groundwork for alliances that would provide much-needed resources and military assistance. Adams' advocacy for forging alliances with European powers led to his appointment as a commissioner to France in November 1777, shortly after the victory at Saratoga. France had been a vital source of financial and material support for the Patriots, but the Congress now sought a formal military alliance. Adams' diplomatic mission aimed to solidify France's commitment, a move that would prove instrumental in securing American independence. Through his tireless efforts in Congress and his strategic vision on the international stage, Adams became a cornerstone of the revolutionary cause. His leadership not only helped sustain the Patriots through the early challenges of the war, but also positioned the United States to gain critical support from European allies, ultimately ensuring the success of the revolution. Adams departed for France in the spring of 1778 with his eldest son, John Quincy Adams, while his wife, Abigail, remained in Braintree, managing the family in his absence. His arrival coincided with the French government already having agreed to a formal alliance with the United States following the American victory at Saratoga. However, Adams faced challenges in his diplomatic role, as the French court, particularly King Louis XVI's ministers, preferred the affable and tactful approach of Benjamin Franklin over Adams' more direct and assertive style. By late 1778, Franklin was elevated to minister plenipotentiary to France, effectively sidelining Adams. Feeling unneeded, Adams chose to return to Massachusetts in March 1779. Adams' respite in America was brief. In late 1779, the Second Continental Congress appointed him to oversee potential peace negotiations with Britain. He returned to Europe and attempted to foster diplomatic progress in Paris, but the British showed little interest in talks as the war stalemated. Frustrated by the lack of progress and persistent tensions with the French, Adams moved to Amsterdam in mid-1780 to seek financial and diplomatic support from the Dutch Republic. The Dutch government initially rebuffed his overtures, refusing to recognize him as the official U.S. ambassador. Adams grew disheartened by what he perceived as European powers prioritizing their own strategic interests over genuine support for the American cause. His health deteriorated, culminating in an illness in August 1781, likely exacerbated by exhaustion and stress. Adams' spirits revived later in 1781 with the stunning news from North America. General Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown in October 1781, following a decisive Franco-American siege, marked a turning point in the war. The British defeat shifted public sentiment in Europe, particularly in the Dutch Republic, where Adams successfully secured recognition of the United States as an independent nation in April 1782. This breakthrough enabled him to negotiate a substantial loan to support the Continental Congress. Adams returned to Paris to participate in formal peace negotiations with a British delegation led by David Hartley. Although the British had little choice but to recognize American independence, numerous contentious issues required resolution. These included establishing the boundary between the United States and British Canada, securing fishing rights off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, and addressing reparations for Loyalists choosing to leave the new nation. Adams, along with Benjamin Franklin and John Jay, worked diligently to finalize the terms of peace. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, officially ending the Revolutionary War. The agreement not only secured American independence but also established critical precedents for the young nation's future, such as territorial boundaries and international trade rights. The Treaty of Paris was a monumental achievement for Adams and his fellow negotiators, representing the culmination of years of military and diplomatic effort. Adams' persistence and strategic acumen in Europe ensured that the United States emerged from the war not only as an independent nation but also as a respected player on the global stage. The conclusion of the war and the signing of the treaty did not result in John Adams returning home. Instead, he was entrusted with what would prove to be one of his most challenging diplomatic roles when he became the first ambassador of the United States to Britain. Arriving in London in 1785, Adams faced the formidable task of establishing friendly relations with a nation that had been the United States' adversary in a recent war, a nation that was not only the largest trading power globally but also shared the longest border with the United States. Shortly after his arrival, Adams met King George III, and their interactions were marked by mutual respect. However, his tenure in London was fraught with difficulties stemming from both the British and American governments' failure to fully honor the provisions of the Treaty of Paris. In Philadelphia, for instance, there was little urgency to compensate British merchants and American loyalists, while the British, in turn, delayed relinquishing control of forts along the Ohio River as agreed. Despite these frustrations, Adams found solace in having his family together. His children were now old enough for Abigail to join him in London, marking the first extended period they had spent together in several years. By 1788, it was evident that Adams had achieved as much as he could in England, and his presence there was no longer necessary. Meanwhile, in the United States, the political environment was undergoing a significant transformation as the nation's leaders worked to draft a new constitution and prepare for the first presidential election. Adams and Abigail returned home, where they observed a vigorous debate between advocates of a more inclusive democracy and conservatives who preferred limiting power to landowners and the wealthy. The culmination of these efforts was the creation of the U.S. Constitution, largely shaped by James Madison, a political thinker from Virginia and a member of the Second Continental Congress, with contributions from figures like Alexander Hamilton. Madison drew heavily from the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, a document to which Adams had made substantial contributions. The new constitution, finalized in 1789, established a bicameral Congress, consisting of an upper house, the Senate, and a lower house, the House of Representatives. This structure balanced the push for popular democracy with the interests of the elite, as the House represented the people while the Senate catered to the concerns of the wealthy and landed classes. The Constitution also introduced a federal system where every state, regardless of size or population, would send 2 senators, ensuring equal representation in legislation. The judiciary was headed by a Supreme Court, while the executive branch was led by a president elected through the Electoral College, a system granting each state a certain number of votes. This carefully designed compromise sought to address the concerns of both conservatives and liberals, as well as proponents of federal power and individual state independence, with checks and balances ensuring no single branch of government could dominate. Adams closely followed the Constitution's development, harboring ambitions to become the first president of the United States. However, it soon became apparent that George Washington was the favored candidate across the 13 states in the election held in late 1788 and early 1789. Recognizing Washington's unassailable position, Adams and other contenders focused their efforts on the vice presidency, leaving Washington uncontested for the highest office. During America's early years, the vice president was elected through the Electoral College, rather than being selected as a running mate by the president, as is customary today. John Adams secured this position and in the spring of 1789, traveled to New York City, which briefly served as the nation's temporary capital before the government relocated to Philadelphia. Meanwhile, construction began on a permanent capital along the Potomac River, which would eventually be named Washington, D.C. in honor of the first president. At the time, the role of vice president held little significance, with its primary constitutional duty being to preside over the Senate. Adams quickly faced resistance from senators, particularly regarding how the president should be addressed. His conservative tendencies and perceived admiration for monarchy became apparent when he suggested the title, Highness, traditionally used for royalty. This proposal was rejected, and the simpler Mr. President was adopted. These early disagreements earned Adams the animosity of many senators. Despite casting more deciding votes in the Senate than almost any other vice president, Adams grew increasingly dissatisfied with his role, famously calling it the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Adams' frustrations were compounded by George Washington's decision to largely exclude him from key policy discussions, with the exception of issues related to France. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789 and led to the Revolutionary Wars, Washington sought Adams' opinion due to his prior diplomatic experience in France. Initially hopeful about the revolution, Adams soon grew disillusioned, seeing it devolve into chaos and violence, particularly during the Reign of Terror in the early 1790s. Despite offering valuable insights on these matters, Adams was generally sidelined within the administration, further deepening his sense of insignificance. Adams' time as vice president coincided with the rise of the first-party system in American politics. This era was defined by the rivalry between the Federalist Party led by Alexander Hamilton and the Democratic-Republican Party founded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The Federalists advocated for a strong central government, industrial development and closer ties with Britain. Their support base was strongest in New England and urbanized states such as New York and Pennsylvania. In contrast, the Democratic Republicans championed agrarianism, Republican ideals and westward expansion, drawing significant support from the southern plantation states. They also expressed more open support for slavery compared to the Federalists. Adams aligned himself with the Federalist Party, endorsing Hamilton's economic policies and advocating for stronger relations with Britain over revolutionary France. When Washington announced he would not seek a third term, fearing that an extended presidency might resemble monarchy or military dictatorship, it opened the door to the first contested presidential election in American history. Jefferson became the leading candidate for the Democratic Republicans, while Adams, despite his uneasy relationship with Hamilton, emerged as the Federalist frontrunner. The campaign was conducted primarily through partisan newspapers, and the rhetoric was fierce, reflecting the widening divisions among the Founding Fathers. Ultimately, Adams narrowly defeated Jefferson, securing 71 Electoral College votes to Jefferson's 68, while another Federalist candidate, Thomas Pinckney, finished third with 59 votes. Although the Democratic Republicans dominated the southern states, Adams managed to win critical support in key middle states like Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, allowing him to claim victory. As the second highest vote-getter, Jefferson became vice president. However, the once strong friendship between Adams and Jefferson had deteriorated over the years, evolving into a tense rivalry fueled by their differing political visions and the growing partisanship of the time. John Adams was inaugurated as president on March 4, 1797. His presidency was dominated by the question of whether the United States should go to war with France, which was embroiled in conflicts with major European powers and undergoing a radical phase of its own revolution. France's hostility toward organized religion and its aggressive foreign policies prompted some Americans to support joining Britain's anti-French coalition. However, many in the U.S. still regarded France as a key ally from the Revolutionary War and harbored lingering resentment against Britain. Adams favored peace and sent a diplomatic delegation to France, but the mission failed disastrously when French officials referred to as X, Y, and Z in reports demanded bribes as a precondition for negotiations. When this scandal, later known as the XYZ affair, became public, it incited widespread outrage against France. Although Adams could have used the incident to justify declaring war, he resisted and maintained American neutrality. While tensions led to a brief quasi-war with France in 1798 to 1799, involving limited naval skirmishes, Adams avoided full-scale conflict, reinforcing a precedent of American reluctance to become entangled in European wars, a principle that persisted until World War II. The XYZ affair also led to heightened fears of foreign subversion within the U.S. In response, Congress enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These four laws targeted French immigrants and those suspected of sympathizing with France. Critics accused Adams of using these acts to suppress political opposition, particularly pro-democratic Republican newspapers. Although Adams had not initiated the legislation and signed it reluctantly, the acts fueled accusations of censorship and executive overreach, controversies that continue to shadow his legacy. Adams' presidency was also marked by his being the first president to reside in Washington, D.C., the newly constructed federal capital. The city, situated on the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia, symbolized efforts to unify the northern and southern states. In November 1800, Adams moved into the president's mansion, later named the White House, and Congress convened for the first time in the Capitol building. Despite these milestones, his term faced challenges including Fry's Rebellion, a tax revolt in Pennsylvania. Adams chose leniency, pardoning the leaders who had been sentenced to death, showcasing his commitment to reconciliation. Tensions with Vice President Thomas Jefferson continued to escalate during Adams' presidency. Their ideological differences on major issues such as relations with France, the role of federal government, and slavery deepened the rift. Jefferson advocated for an alliance with France and supported slavery, owning hundreds of enslaved individuals, while Adams opposed slavery and was instrumental in its gradual abolition in Massachusetts. This division culminated in the fiercely contested election of 1800. Jefferson, running with Aaron Burr as his vice presidential candidate, narrowly defeated Adams, whose campaign suffered from internal Federalist divisions and public dissatisfaction with taxation and foreign policy. After leaving office, Adams retired to his family farm in Quincy, Massachusetts. He avoided active participation in politics, adhering to the precedent set by George Washington. However, his relationship with Jefferson remained strained until 1812, when mutual friend Benjamin Rush facilitated their reconciliation. The two former presidents exchanged letters for over a decade discussing philosophy, retirement, and reflections on their shared history, though they largely avoided revisiting their political disagreements. Adams lived to see his eldest son, John Quincy Adams, elected as the 6th President of the United States in 1825, a source of great pride. He passed away on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, just hours after Jefferson's death. Adams was laid to rest alongside his wife Abigail at the United First Parish Church in Quincy, leaving behind a complex but enduring legacy. John Adams, the 2nd President of the United States, was a visionary leader who helped lay the foundation of American democracy. He played a crucial role in drafting the Declaration of Independence and was a fierce advocate for liberty and justice. Adams' dedication to the rule of law and his diplomatic efforts, particularly in securing peace with France, showcased his commitment to the nation's stability. His presidency emphasized the importance of a balanced government and civil liberties, leaving a lasting legacy. Even after his tenure, Adams remained a symbol of integrity and patriotism in American history. Thomas Jefferson, one of the most influential figures in American history, was born on April 13, 1743, at the Shadwell Plantation. This estate, located just outside Charlottesville, Virginia, was part of the prosperous holdings of his father, Peter Jefferson. Peter was a man of significant standing in colonial Virginia, working as both a surveyor and a planter. He owned multiple plantations, including Shadwell, which he had established in the 1730s. Like many plantations of that era, Shadwell relied on enslaved labor alongside free workers to sustain its operations, primarily focused on tobacco cultivation. During Jefferson's early years, Virginia was one of the 13 British colonies in North America. However, within a few decades, it would become a leading state in the revolutionary movement that led to the creation of the United States of America. The Jefferson family had deep roots in Virginia, tracing their presence back to 1612. Peter Jefferson was a prominent member of Virginia society, holding respected roles such as a colonel in the militia and a representative in the Virginia House of Burgesses. His leadership and influence left a lasting impression on young Thomas, who admired his father's ability to command respect and maintain authority within the community. Jefferson's mother, Jane Randolph, came from an equally prestigious background. She was a member of the Randolph family, one of the most influential in Virginia's history. The Randolphs had arrived in the colony in 1642, and by the 1670s Jane's grandfather, William Randolph, had amassed tens of thousands of acres of land, establishing a network of 11 plantations. Jane's father, Isham Randolph, was a sea captain whose life alternated between Virginia and London. It was in London, specifically in the Shadwell parish, that Jane was born in February 1720. When she married Peter Jefferson in 1739, they named their plantation Shadwell, a nod to her birthplace. Together, Peter and Jane Jefferson had 8 children, 6 daughters and 2 sons, with Thomas being the eldest. Raised amidst the privileges of the Virginia elite, Thomas spent much of his childhood between 2 estates, Shadwell and Tuckahoe. In 1745, the Jefferson family temporarily moved to Tuckahoe so Peter could oversee the management of the estate, which belonged to his late cousin William Randolph. 7 years later, in 1752, they returned to Shadwell, where Thomas continued his upbringing. Peter Jefferson deeply regretted his lack of formal education and was determined that his son would receive the best schooling available. At the age of 9, Thomas was sent to live with Reverend William Douglas, a clergyman who provided him with foundational lessons in French, as well as in Latin and Greek. Later, he studied under Reverend James Morey, a more accomplished classical scholar, who introduced Thomas to the literature, philosophy, and history of ancient Greece and Rome. This early exposure to classical ideas profoundly shaped Jefferson's intellectual development. Building on this solid foundation, Jefferson enrolled at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia's capital. By the time he left for college, his father had passed away in 1757, leaving Thomas at just 14 years old, as the head of his household. As the eldest son, he inherited the Shadwell estate, which included more than 2,750 acres of land and 66 enslaved individuals. However, the practical management of the estate was handled by his mother Jane, who ensured its continued operation. In 1770, a fire devastated the Shadwell home, reducing it to ruins. Undeterred, Jane Jefferson took it upon herself to rebuild the residence, which remained in the family for 2 subsequent generations. Although much of the correspondence between Thomas and his mother was lost in the fire, evidence suggests that their relationship was amicable. Jefferson continued to live at Shadwell well into adulthood, indicating a stable bond with his mother until her death in 1776. At William and Mary, Jefferson immersed himself in a rigorous academic environment. He studied under Dr. William Small, a Scottish professor who taught mathematics and moral philosophy. Small's teachings introduced Jefferson to the revolutionary ideas of the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that emphasized reason, science, and human progress over tradition and religious dogma. These concepts had a profound impact on Jefferson, shaping his views on governance and society. Jefferson's academic life was intense. He was known to study for as many as 15 hours a day, devouring works by luminaries such as Isaac Newton, John Locke, and Adam Smith. Despite his heavy study schedule, Jefferson maintained a commitment to physical activity, exercising for 2 hours daily. An accomplished violinist, he also performed regularly at the governor's palace in Williamsburg, where he mingled with Virginia's political elite, including his cousin Peyton Randolph, the royal attorney general. The colonial government in Virginia mirrored the structure of the British political system. The king appointed the governor and the Council of State, which acted as the upper house of the General Assembly. The lower house, known as the House of Burgesses, was elected by free white men. Peter Jefferson had represented Albemarle County in the House of Burgesses, and he instilled in his son a strong sense of loyalty to the British Crown. After completing his studies, Jefferson spent 5 years training as a lawyer. He divided his time between Williamsburg and Shadwell during a period when tensions between Britain and its American colonies were steadily rising. These tensions were fueled by Britain's efforts to recover the costs of the 7 Years' War, 1754 to 1763, a global conflict in which Britain had secured significant territorial gains in North America. Although Britain emerged victorious, gaining control of French colonies in Canada and Spanish Florida, the war left the empire heavily indebted. To cover the expenses of maintaining a military presence in North America, British authorities introduced new taxes on the colonies. In 1764, Prime Minister George Grenville announced the Sugar Act, imposing duties on various colonial imports. Grenville declared Parliament's absolute authority to levy taxes across the British Empire, a stance that provoked outrage in the colonies. Virginia, like other colonies, objected vehemently to these measures, asserting that taxes should not be imposed without the consent of colonial representatives. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry. The situation escalated with the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, which taxed printed materials, sparking widespread protests organized by groups like the Sons of Liberty. This Boston-founded organization rapidly expanded across the colonies, fueling resistance against British policies. Thomas Jefferson, a keen observer of the passionate debates within the Virginia House of Burgesses, was notably influenced by the speeches of Patrick Henry. Henry, a lawyer renowned for his fiery oratory, became an advocate for the most radical measures of resistance against British policies. His denunciations of the British Crown and Parliament were so vehement that many of his more conservative colleagues accused him of treason. Yet despite the intense rhetoric, even the most outspoken figures like Henry were not advocating for the 13 colonies to sever ties with the British Crown, nor were they suggesting the use of armed conflict to achieve independence. By the end of 1765, the mounting colonial opposition to the Stamp Act prompted the British Parliament to recognize the depth of discontent in the American colonies. The act, which had levied taxes on printed materials, was repealed in February 1766. However, Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, affirming its authority to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. While the Declaratory Act was intended to preserve Parliament's dignity, it did little to pacify the colonies. The ongoing disputes had evolved from debates about taxation into broader issues concerning political rights and resistance to arbitrary governance. Over the next decade, repeated attempts by Britain to enforce its authority were met with increasing defiance from the colonies. Tensions escalated to the point where the conflict shifted from political discourse to armed confrontation, setting the stage for revolution. During this period, Jefferson embarked on a promising legal career after being admitted to the bar in 1767. Living at Shadwell, his family estate, he traveled extensively to argue cases in courthouses throughout Virginia. His political career began shortly thereafter, as he was elected on December 15, 1768, to represent Albemarle County in the House of Burgesses. This marked the first of many public offices he would hold in a career that would define his legacy. In May of that same year, Jefferson had initiated plans to construct a new residence on a hilltop near Shadwell. He named this estate Monticello, meaning Little Mountain in Italian. Designed by Jefferson himself and constantly remodeled to align with contemporary architectural trends, Monticello would become synonymous with his name. The devastating fire at Shadwell in 1770 accelerated his move to Monticello, despite the house being incomplete. The fire destroyed Jefferson's library and the legal papers he was working on at the time. Nevertheless, Monticello became his permanent home and a symbol of his ingenuity and vision. It was to Monticello that Jefferson brought his wife, Martha Wales Jefferson, following their marriage in January 1772. Known as Patty to her family and close friends, Martha was born in 1748 into a prominent Virginia family. Her father, John Wales, was both a wealthy landowner and a client of Jefferson during his legal career. After being widowed at a young age in 1768, Martha attracted the attention of numerous suitors including Jefferson. The two bonded over their shared love of music, with Jefferson often serenading her on the violin while she accompanied him on the piano. Their marriage, although occasionally marked by disagreements due to Martha's strong-willed nature, was a loving one. Together, they had 6 children, though only 2 survived infancy, reflecting the high child mortality rates of the era. As Jefferson's personal life unfolded, the colony's relationship with Britain continued to deteriorate. The Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, saw members of the Sons of Liberty destroy a shipment of tea in protest against British taxation. This act of defiance prompted Parliament to pass the Intolerable Acts in 1774, including the Boston Port Act, which closed the port until the East India Company was compensated for the lost tea. These punitive measures further galvanized colonial opposition. In Virginia, Jefferson and his peers passed resolutions expressing solidarity with Boston and advocating a boycott of British goods. Amidst the growing unrest, the First Continental Congress convened on September 5, 1774, in Philadelphia. Although Jefferson was not a delegate, he made a significant contribution by drafting a document titled A Summary View of the Rights of British America. In this pamphlet, Jefferson articulated the colony's grievances and argued for their right to self-governance, urging King George III to address these issues fairly. His eloquent plea for equality and justice elevated him to prominence among colonial leaders, showcasing his exceptional abilities as a political writer. By late 1774, it became evident that reconciliation between Britain and its American colonies was unlikely. Both sides prepared for conflict, with the colonies mobilizing militias to counter potential military crackdowns. The situation reached a breaking point on April 19, 1775, when the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. This marked the beginning of an armed struggle that would ultimately lead to the birth of a new nation. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May 1775, initially under the presidency of Peyton Randolph. However, Randolph was soon recalled to Williamsburg to oversee the proceedings of the Virginia House of Burgesses. In his absence, Thomas Jefferson was chosen as his replacement, arriving in Philadelphia on June 11. By this time, the escalating hostilities between Britain and the colonies had transformed the Congress into a permanent governing body, tasked with uniting the colonies in their resistance and coordinating efforts in what was rapidly evolving into a full-scale war. Shortly after Jefferson's arrival, the Congress approved John Adams's proposal to appoint George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a pivotal step in organizing the colonial forces. Unlike some of his peers, Jefferson was not a gifted orator. He preferred working behind the scenes, contributing his talents in drafting resolutions, declarations, and reports. His mastery of the written word allowed him to influence policy and public opinion from a quieter, more strategic position. By June 1776, the Congress had begun deliberations on the critical issue of whether to formally declare independence from the British Empire. Jefferson, alongside John Adams, was selected to draft the declaration. Recognizing Jefferson's superior writing skills and his role as a representative of Virginia, the largest and most influential colony, Adams persuaded him to compose the initial draft. Jefferson's draft began with an introduction articulating the colony's intent to sever ties with the British Crown. The preamble, however, became the cornerstone of the Declaration of Independence, encapsulating the foundational principles of the emerging nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This powerful statement was followed by an extensive list of grievances against King George III. Jefferson framed the monarch as the primary antagonist, effectively prosecuting him in the court of public opinion. This deliberate shift away from blaming Parliament ensured that reconciliation would no longer be possible, as the king had previously been viewed as a protector of colonial rights. When Jefferson's draft was debated by Congress, several alterations were made to moderate its tone and content. A particularly contentious passage condemning slavery and the transatlantic slave trade was removed to appease delegates from the southern colonies, whose economies were deeply reliant on enslaved labor. Although Jefferson expressed disappointment at these revisions, he took pride in knowing that the document ratified on July 4, 1776, contained words that would resonate through the ages. Having gained international recognition as a principal advocate for American independence, Jefferson yearned to return to Virginia. His personal life had been marked by loss. In the preceding year he had endured the deaths of his mother, one of his daughters, and his cousin, Peyton Randolph. Adding to his burdens, Jefferson's wife Martha was in fragile health. For these reasons, he declined an invitation to join a diplomatic mission to France aimed at securing an alliance with King Louis XVI. While Jefferson remained in Virginia, the Franco-American alliance was successfully formalized in February 1778, giving the colonies a crucial advantage. Jefferson turned his focus to reforming Virginia's legal and political systems, striving to dismantle the entrenched power of the landed elite and broaden access to education. He was particularly devoted to the cause of religious freedom, arguing that no faith could claim absolute truth. Although his proposals for religious tolerance were initially rejected, they would be revisited and adopted a decade later. On the issue of slavery, Jefferson found himself in a complex moral quandary. While he opposed the institution in principle and saw it as incompatible with the ideals of liberty, he remained a slaveholder throughout his life, owning over 600 individuals. Jefferson doubted the possibility of coexistence between free black and white populations, a perspective that shaped his actions or lack thereof on this issue. As the Revolutionary War raged on, Virginia faced increasing threats from British forces. In 1779, Jefferson was elected governor of Virginia, assuming the role of civilian war leader during a period of immense peril. He dealt with internal Loyalist uprisings and Native American raids while relocating the state capital from Williamsburg to Richmond, a safer inland location. Despite these precautions, Virginia was invaded in December 1780 by Benedict Arnold, a former Continental Army general who had defected to the British. Jefferson's response was slow, narrowly avoiding capture as Arnold's troops sacked Richmond. The British campaign escalated in the spring of 1781, with Lord Cornwallis and Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton leading a brutal southern offensive. Jefferson relocated the capital again, this time to Charlottesville, and urgently appealed to George Washington for reinforcements to save Virginia from collapse. In the early hours of June 4, 1781, as Thomas Jefferson prepared to relinquish his position as governor of Virginia, he was at Monticello when alarming news reached him. British cavalry under the command of Banastre Tarleton was approaching his estate with orders to capture him. Once again, Jefferson narrowly escaped British hands, fleeing just in time. After stepping down as governor, Jefferson faced scrutiny from the Virginia General Assembly regarding his actions during the tumultuous final year of his term. Although he was ultimately exonerated of any wrongdoing, Jefferson felt that his reputation had been tarnished. This sense of disillusionment persisted, even as the tide of the war turned in favor of the Americans. On October 19, 1781, Lord Cornwallis surrendered to General George Washington and his French allies at Yorktown, effectively ending large-scale hostilities and paving the way for peace talks that would recognize American independence. Jefferson's political struggles were soon overshadowed by personal tragedy. His wife Martha gave birth to a daughter in May 1782, but her health rapidly declined thereafter. Confined to bed, she passed away on September 6, 1782, with Jefferson by her side. In the midst of his grief, Jefferson accepted an invitation in 1783 to join the American delegation engaged in peace negotiations in Paris. However, before his departure, he learned that the treaty's draft terms had already been agreed upon, offering the fledgling United States remarkably favorable conditions. These terms were designed to isolate France and Spain, America's allies, from further territorial or political gains. Instead, Jefferson was elected on June 6, 1783, to represent Virginia at the Continental Congress, a fragile national body with limited authority. Jefferson believed that the weaknesses of the Congress posed a risk of disunity and potential conflict among the states. This became evident when Congress struggled to assemble the necessary quorum to ratify the Treaty of Paris, which was only achieved on January 14, 1784. On July 5, 1784, after less than a year in Congress, Jefferson embarked on a diplomatic mission to France as the United States ambassador. Jefferson had long admired France, particularly for its alliance with America during the Revolutionary War, and he saw this appointment as an opportunity to strengthen ties and ensure American security in the event of future British aggression. Jefferson's time in France coincided with the nation's descent into revolution. King Louis XVI's government was deeply in debt, exacerbated by France's military support of the American Revolution. While the French common people faced dire poverty and hunger, the aristocracy and the Catholic Church resisted efforts to impose taxes on their wealth. With few options remaining, the king reluctantly convened the Estates General in 1789, a political assembly that had not been called in over 150 years. The gathering of the Estates General led to a surge of proposals for reform, as representatives from the church, nobility, and commoners debated the future of French governance. Jefferson observed these developments closely, welcoming the possibility of an end to royal absolutism. Even while stationed in Paris, Jefferson remained deeply involved in American affairs. He closely followed the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia from May 25 to September 17, 1787, where delegates sought to establish a stronger federal government. Though Jefferson had previously criticized the weaknesses of the national government under the Articles of Confederation, his experiences in revolutionary France caused him to fear that an overly powerful central government could lead to tyranny. When Jefferson reviewed the draft Constitution, he approved of its separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. However, he expressed concerns about the presidency, which lacked term limits and could potentially allow a single individual to remain in office indefinitely. He was also disappointed by the absence of a Bill of Rights to safeguard individual and state freedoms against federal overreach. Despite its imperfections, Jefferson supported the Constitution, trusting that it could be improved through amendments. This faith was validated when a Bill of Rights was adopted as the first 10 amendments before the Constitution's ratification on June 21, 1788. During Jefferson's final months in France, the French Revolution erupted. Unable to resolve procedural disputes, representatives of the Third Estate, the commoners, declared themselves the National Assembly. As unrest spread, royal authority crumbled, culminating in the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789. Jefferson maintained close friendships with key revolutionaries, including the Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought alongside Washington during the American Revolution. Lafayette, then one of France's most admired figures, served as commander of the National Guard, tasked with maintaining order in Paris and protecting the royal family from radical factions. Collaborating with Lafayette, Jefferson helped draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted by the National Assembly on August 26, 1789. This landmark document, which proclaimed that human beings are born and remain free and equal in rights, echoed the principles Jefferson had articulated in the Declaration of Independence. Having contributed significantly to both French and American political developments, Jefferson left France in late September 1789. Returning to Virginia on November 23, he planned to resume his diplomatic duties. However, in December, he was appointed Secretary of State by President George Washington, who had been unanimously elected under the new Constitution and inaugurated on April 30, 1789. As Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson assumed the role of President George Washington's chief foreign policy advisor, a position well suited to his extensive diplomatic experience in France and his deep understanding of international relations. Accepting Washington's invitation, Jefferson departed Virginia for New York, which at the time served as the nation's capital, and officially began his duties in March 1790. While Jefferson's primary responsibilities centered on managing the young nation's foreign affairs, his role as a member of Washington's cabinet inevitably involved him in the broader debates shaping the United States' political future. The cabinet itself was composed of individuals with diverse visions for the country's path forward, reflecting a range of perspectives on governance, economics, and federal authority. Jefferson's voice in these discussions often emphasized the importance of individual liberty, state sovereignty, and a restrained federal government, aligning with his philosophical convictions. As Secretary of State, Jefferson served as President Washington's chief foreign policy advisor, a role well suited to his diplomatic experience in France. He accepted the position and relocated from Virginia to New York, the federal government's seat at the time, officially beginning his duties in March 1790. Although Jefferson's primary responsibility was foreign affairs, his position in Washington's cabinet also immersed him in debates about the future political direction of the United States. The administration was largely dominated by the Federalists, a faction that advocated for a strong central government as essential to national prosperity and security. Among its leading figures were Vice President John Adams and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who had been one of Washington's closest confidants since the Revolutionary War. Hamilton, at just 34 years old, had already left a significant mark on American politics, authoring the majority of the Federalist Papers and championing the Constitution's adoption in 1789. Jefferson, by contrast, identified as a Democratic Republican, firmly opposing Federalist policies. He believed in defending states' rights and individual liberties against potential overreach by the federal government. Jefferson saw Hamilton's vision as favoring northern commercial elites over the agrarian interests of the southern states, fostering conditions for tyranny akin to what the Revolution had sought to overthrow. A sharp ideological rivalry developed between Jefferson and Hamilton, with tensions flaring over Hamilton's financial proposals. Hamilton sought to establish a national bank to manage the debt, consolidate state debts under federal control, and empower Congress to levy taxes to repay them. These measures were strongly supported by debt-laden northern states like New York and Massachusetts, but vehemently opposed by southern states like Virginia and North Carolina, which had managed their finances more prudently. The stalemate in Congress was broken through a compromise brokered by Jefferson and Hamilton. The southern states agreed to Hamilton's proposals in exchange for relocating the federal capital to a more southern location along the Potomac River, in what would become Washington, D.C. The domestic policy debate spilled over into foreign policy. While Federalists like Adams and Hamilton sought to rebuild ties with Great Britain, Jefferson favored closer relations with revolutionary France, whose ideals mirrored those of the American Revolution. However, the increasingly radical turn of the French Revolution, particularly the Jacobin-led Reign of Terror in 1793, tested Jefferson's pro-French stance. The executions of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, along with the exile of moderates like Lafayette, lent credibility to Federalist warnings of revolutionary anarchy. Despite these developments, Jefferson remained loyal to the ideals of the French Revolution. When France declared war on Britain in February 1793, Jefferson privately opposed Washington's proclamation of neutrality. However, his position was weakened by the conduct of French envoy Edmond Charles Genet, who openly criticized Washington and attempted to draw the United States into hostilities with Britain. By late 1793, the political animosity between Jefferson and Hamilton reached a breaking point. Both men offered their resignations, but while Washington persuaded Hamilton to stay, he reluctantly accepted Jefferson's resignation on January 1, 1794. Retreating to Monticello, Jefferson spent the next 2 years in semi-retirement, remodeling his home and enjoying a respite from national politics. Nevertheless, he kept a watchful eye on developments through correspondence with Republican allies. The ratification of the Jay Treaty in 1795 was a particularly bitter blow. While the treaty improved trade relations with Britain and was celebrated by Federalists, it infuriated Republicans and provoked outrage in France, straining Franco-American relations. After intense political battles, the Senate narrowly approved the treaty in August 1795, and it took effect in early 1796. However, it wasn't until April of that year that Congress, following a narrow vote, allocated the necessary funds to fulfill its terms. Following this political setback and with Washington's second term nearing its end, the Republicans began searching for a challenger to the presidency. The choice was clear: Thomas Jefferson. On September 19, 1796, President Washington published his farewell address, announcing his decision to retire from public life and not seek a third term. In this address, he urged national unity and warned against the spirit of party, which he saw as a source of political instability and a potential pathway to despotism under the guise of restoring order. Washington had witnessed firsthand how the rivalry between Jefferson and Hamilton had strained his administration. Despite his warnings, Washington's retirement ushered in the first truly contested presidential election in American history. The Federalists backed John Adams for the presidency, while the Democratic Republicans rallied behind Jefferson. Under the Constitution at the time, each elector in the Electoral College cast 2 votes. The candidate with the majority became president, and the runner-up became vice president. Electors were chosen by state legislatures in most states, and political networks, rather than public campaigning, played the decisive role. After the votes were counted, Adams narrowly defeated Jefferson, securing 71 electoral votes to Jefferson's 68. On March 4, 1797, John Adams became the second President of the United States, with Jefferson as his vice president. Though once close allies, the growing ideological divide between the Federalists and Republicans had strained their relationship. Adams's presidency unfolded in a tense international atmosphere, with fears of war involving Britain or France casting a shadow over American politics. In 1798, Adams revealed that an American delegation to France had been met with demands for bribes by French officials, an incident known as the XYZ affair. Public outrage ensued, and relations with France deteriorated, leading to the undeclared Quasi-War, during which French naval forces attacked American shipping. In response, Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which empowered the president to deport foreigners deemed a security risk and made it illegal to publish defamatory statements about the government. Jefferson, viewing these measures as a dangerous step toward authoritarianism, quietly orchestrated Republican opposition to the laws through press criticism and advice to state governments. Jefferson's vice presidency was fraught with challenges. While publicly supporting the administration, he privately acted as a leader of the opposition. The tension culminated in the 1800 election, as Adams and Jefferson prepared for a rematch. By this time, the federal government had moved from Philadelphia to its permanent home in Washington, D.C., a city named for the late President Washington, who had died on December 14, 1799. The 1800 election was one of the most contentious in American history. Jefferson's running mate, Aaron Burr, played a crucial role in securing Republican dominance in New York, which helped swing the election. However, when the Electoral College votes were tallied, Jefferson and Burr were tied with 73 votes each, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives. The House, dominated by Federalists, deliberated for 6 days starting on February 11, 1801. Federalists sought to exploit the situation, some supporting Burr to deny Jefferson the presidency. Behind the scenes, negotiations took place. Jefferson refused to agree to conditions that would restrict his policy decisions but eventually gained the support needed to prevail. On February 17, 1801, after 36 ballots, Jefferson was elected president. Ironically, Jefferson's victory owed much to Alexander Hamilton, who disliked both Jefferson and Burr but regarded Jefferson as the lesser of two evils. Hamilton's influence persuaded several Federalists to switch their votes to Jefferson. This rivalry with Burr would later culminate in their infamous duel in 1804, which resulted in Hamilton's death. On March 4, 1801, Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as the third President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he called for unity, famously stating, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have been called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." This appeal to moderation reassured those who feared Jefferson would dismantle Federalist institutions, though he did appoint key Republican allies to his cabinet. As Secretary of State, the new president selected James Madison, his Virginia protege who had been a trusted source of political counsel for nearly 3 decades. Albert Gallatin, a Pennsylvanian Republican and a prominent leader in opposing the Alien and Sedition Acts in the House of Representatives, was appointed Secretary of the Treasury. During his 8-year presidency, Jefferson reduced federal obligations, cutting the national debt from $83 million to $57 million and scaling back military expenditures to pre-war levels. He dismissed the value of engaging in an arms race with European powers, favoring neutrality in their conflicts. Jefferson's presidency is most notably linked to America's westward expansion. Although he never traveled west of Virginia, his father's experiences on the western frontier had intrigued him since childhood. Early leaders of the American Republic feared European powers in North America, particularly Britain and Spain, as well as indigenous tribes, might obstruct the nation's expansion beyond the Mississippi River. These concerns intensified following the Third Treaty of San Ildefonso in October 1800, a secret Franco-Spanish agreement transferring the Louisiana territory to France in exchange for Italian lands. Napoleon Bonaparte, then First Consul of France, appeared intent on establishing a new empire in North America, a prospect that alarmed Jefferson, as French control of New Orleans threatened the economic lifeline of the southern states. Despite his Francophile inclinations, Jefferson was willing to ally with Britain to safeguard American interests. However, he first sought to purchase New Orleans from Napoleon. Jefferson tasked James Monroe with negotiating alongside Robert Livingston, the American ambassador in Paris. Monroe, a former Virginia governor and longtime friend of Jefferson and Madison, handled the sensitive mission. By early 1803, shifting developments made the sale of New Orleans more appealing to Napoleon. The fragile peace between France and Britain was unraveling, and Napoleon's ambitions in the Americas had suffered a major blow following the disastrous loss of his forces to yellow fever in Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti. Faced with these challenges and aware of Louisiana's vulnerability to British attack, Napoleon offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. Monroe and Livingston finalized the agreement in April 1803, and Congress ratified it in October, more than doubling the nation's size overnight. Although Jefferson was celebrated for the Louisiana Purchase, critics accused him of overstepping constitutional limits since Congress had allocated only $10 million for the deal. Despite his reservations about expanding executive power, Jefferson defended the acquisition. Even before the purchase, Jefferson had secured congressional approval for an expedition to explore the Western Territories. He appointed Captain Meriwether Lewis, a Virginian and Revolutionary War veteran, to lead the mission. Lewis invited Lieutenant William Clark to co-lead, and together they formed the Corps of Discovery. Departing from St. Louis in 1804, the expedition reached the Pacific in 1805, returning by 1806. Jefferson avidly followed their progress, dedicating a room in the presidential mansion to display their natural artifacts and accounts. Jefferson's vision of westward expansion embodied his ideal of an agrarian republic. His first-term achievements, including tax reductions and the Louisiana Purchase, earned him widespread popularity. Despite Federalist opposition in the press, Jefferson won re-election in 1804 by a landslide, securing 162 electoral votes to 14. His second term, however, brought challenges. Vice President Aaron Burr's political career ended after killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel, and rumors of Burr's treasonous plans led to his arrest and trial in 1807. In foreign policy, Jefferson faced increasing tensions with Britain. Following the Chesapeake Leopard affair in 1807, he implemented the Embargo Act, halting trade with all foreign nations. While the act prevented war and encouraged domestic industry, it was widely unpopular due to rising costs of goods. Jefferson retired to Monticello in 1809, spending his later years with family and maintaining correspondence with John Adams, with whom he rekindled a friendship. Both men died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of American independence. While Jefferson is celebrated as a visionary statesman, his legacy is marred by contradictions regarding slavery. DNA evidence supports claims that he fathered children with Sally Hemings, but Jefferson kept most of his slaves in bondage, unlike George Washington, who freed his upon his death. Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming all men as equals, remain a stark contrast to the realities of slavery during and long after his time. Thomas Jefferson's legacy of liberty, education, and innovation continues to shape the fabric of our nation, inspiring generations to strive for a more perfect union. However, his complex relationship with slavery raises important questions about the contradictions between his ideals and his actions. What are your thoughts on Thomas Jefferson's legacy? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what topics you'd like to see next.